She walked into the most feared building in Manhattan ready to die, and the devil behind the desk handed her a diamond ring instead. At 22 years old, Elizabeth Bennet stepped through the revolving doors of Sterling Tower with nothing in her pocket but a folded farewell letter to her father. The November rain lashed the glass walls of the lobby like nails against a coffin. Her old black wool coat clung to her shoulders, heavy with cold water and the weight of a decision no daughter should ever have to make. In her right hand, a small leather suitcase. Inside it, one change of clothes she would never wear, a hairbrush she would never use again, and the letter sealed with a kiss she could not give in person. She had stopped trembling somewhere between the cab and the elevator. Fear, she had learned in the last 36 hours, eventually burns itself out. What replaces it is something colder, something steadier. The flat, glassy calm of a person who has already accepted the shape of her own ending. The lobby of Sterling Tower was a cathedral of polished black granite. 2 guards in tailored charcoal suits flanked the private elevator on the far wall, and neither of them needed to ask her name. Word of her arrival had traveled up the building before she had even crossed 42nd Street. One of them held out a gloved hand. She gave him her phone, her wallet, and her suitcase without protest. The other ran a metal wand down her body in a single professional sweep, then nodded toward the elevator. The doors opened with the silence of a vault. The ride to the 47th floor took 18 seconds. Elizabeth counted every one of them. She watched the floor numbers climb in soft amber digits, and somewhere around the 25th floor she began rehearsing the sentence she had practiced in the cab. Please, take me instead. By the 38th floor the words had been stripped down to a single syllable. Please. By the 45th, even that was gone. The elevator opened onto a private corridor lined with dark walnut. At the end of it, a door stood open. Beyond the door, a man stood at floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, watching the storm chew its way across Central Park. He did not turn when she entered. He did not have to. The very air in the room had already turned to face her. Elizabeth stepped onto the white marble floor and noted, with the strange clarity of the condemned, how easy it would be to clean blood off a surface like this. The thought did not frighten her. It steadied her. She had spent the cab ride imagining the angle of a bullet, the sound it would make, whether her body would fall forward or back. She had decided forward was better. Forward looked less like surrender. She walked to the center of the room, set her shoulders, and spoke before her nerve could betray her. Mr. Sterling, my name is Elizabeth Bennet. My father is David Bennet. I have come to settle his debt. The man at the window did not move. There is no debt my father can pay, she said. But I can. I am here in his place. Whatever you need to do, do it to me. Let him go home. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the rain. Then Ethan Sterling turned around. He did not reach for the weapon she could see holstered beneath his open suit jacket. He did not call for his men. He looked at her face, at her throat, at the small silver charm resting in the hollow of her collarbone, and something behind his eyes broke and reformed in the space of a single heartbeat. He crossed to the desk in 3 measured strides. From the top drawer he drew a small black velvet box. He set it on the polished walnut and slid it toward her across the dark grain. Elizabeth stared at it, stared at him. The lid lifted under her shaking fingers. Inside, on a bed of black silk, lay a flawless 5-carat diamond cold, brilliant, impossibly heavy with meaning. Ethan Sterling watched her face. You don't have to die tonight, Miss Bennet, he said quietly. I need a wife. 36 hours earlier, Elizabeth Bennet had been a different person. She had been sitting in the 3rd row of Avery Hall at Columbia University, sketching the cantilever of a Frank Lloyd Wright structure into the margins of her notebook, when her phone buzzed against the wooden desk. The name on the screen was Howard Klein, the family lawyer her father had used twice in his entire life, once for the lease of their Queens apartment and once for her mother's will. She slipped out of the lecture hall and answered in the corridor. Elizabeth, sit down. Find a wall. She found one. The cold marble of Columbia's hallway pressed into her shoulder blades. Your father was taken into custody this morning at the Brooklyn Marine Terminal. Sterling Holdings filed a private criminal complaint. They are alleging he stole a container off Pier 12. The shipment is valued at $12 million. She heard her own voice answer from somewhere very far away. My father has never stolen anything in his life. He logs every clipboard he touches. I know, but the paperwork has his signature. 3 witnesses. A handoff log with a forged customs seal. Where is he? That, Klein said carefully, is the second problem. By the time she reached the 84th precinct in Brooklyn, the rain had begun. The desk sergeant could not find her father's name in the booking system. A second officer checked the federal hold list. Nothing. A young FBI liaison in a cheap Navy suit eventually came down to the lobby, looked at her with the kind of pity reserved for people about to learn how the world really worked, and told her the Bureau had no jurisdiction over a civil dispute initiated by Sterling Holdings, a janitor whispered to her on the way out. He did not look at her face. He spoke into the wet floor between them. Honey, they didn't bring him here. Sterling people don't bring their problems to precincts. He's in one of their warehouses by now. You go home. You don't ask any more questions in this building. She went home. Her apartment in Queens was a railroad walk-up above a Greek bakery on Steinway Street, and the smell of warm sesame bread had always made it feel like a place where nothing terrible could ever happen. The red envelope was wedged under her door at 6:32 in the evening. No stamp, no return address. The wax seal on the back was the color of arterial blood. Inside were two things. The first was a photograph. David Bennett, 54 years old, bound to a metal folding chair, head tipped against his shoulder, the corner of his mouth split open. The lighting was industrial. The floor behind him was concrete. The second was a folded sheet of cream-colored cardstock. 8 words in fountain pen ink. Sterling Tower. 11 o'clock tomorrow night. Come alone. Bring whatever you value most. Elizabeth read it 4 times. Then she walked to the small closet at the foot of her bed and pulled down the rosewood box her mother had given her. On her 12th birthday, the last birthday Margaret Bennett had lived to see. The lacquer had dulled in 10 years. The brass clasp was tarnished. Inside lay the only 2 things she had left of her mother: a blank leather notebook with creamy, unwritten pages, and a small silver paper crane, suspended from a fine chain, its wings folded in razor-precise lines. She had worn the crane every day since she was 8 years old. She unclasped it now. She held it in her palm. She thought of how much a pawn shop on Northern Boulevard might give her for it. $300. Maybe 4. Enough to buy a knife. Enough to buy a bus ticket. Enough to do absolutely nothing for her father. She fastened the chain back around her neck. Then she sat at her tiny kitchen table, took a single sheet of paper from her sketchbook, and began to write. Dad, if you are reading this, it means I did not come home. I want you to know I went on my own. Nobody made me. I am paying what I owe, what we owe, because you raised me to. I am not afraid. I love you. I will trade everything I have for your life. Even that. She signed it. She folded it. She placed it in the top drawer of her nightstand, under her mother's blank notebook, where no one would think to look for 48 hours. Then she put on her old black wool coat and walked out into the rain. The cab dropped her at the corner of Park and 46th at 10:50 in the evening, and Elizabeth walked the last block on foot because she wanted her legs to remember what walking felt like. The lobby of Sterling Tower was already expecting her. The night doorman did not greet her, did not ask her name, did not look up from the register. He pressed a button beneath the desk and turned his face away like a man who had learned never to remember faces. 2 men in identical charcoal suits, separated from the dark granite columns on either side of the entry, and walked toward her with the unhurried gait of professionals who had never lost a target in their lives. The taller of the 2 held out an open palm. She placed her phone into it. The shorter one lifted her suitcase from her grip with 2 fingers, set it on a glass console, and opened it as if diffusing something. He pulled out the single folded blouse, the toothbrush, the small zip pouch with her identification, and finally the sealed envelope addressed to David Bennett. He did not open the envelope. He read the name on the front, looked at her for a half-second longer than necessary, and replaced everything in the order he had found it. A black metal wand traveled the length of her body. It chirped once at the silver chain around her throat. The shorter guard glanced at the small charm, decided it was nothing, and waved her on. The private elevator at the rear of the lobby had no buttons. It opened the instant they approached. Inside, the walls were brushed steel and the light was the dim amber of old gold. The doors closed. The car rose. She did not count the floors this time. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the exact tone of her father's laugh. The doors opened onto a corridor she had not seen on her first imagined version of this walk. Dark walnut panels. A long runner of charcoal wool. At the far end, a single door of pale oak stood open by perhaps 4 inches, and warm light bled out across the floor in a thin yellow blade. She pushed it open with her fingertips. The office occupied the entire northwest corner of the 47th floor. 2 of the walls were glass, ceiling to floor, and through them Central Park lay below in a black, glittering wound, a darkness wrapped in the burning grid of the city. The desk was carved from a single slab of dark walnut, polished to the depth of a still pond. 2 leather chairs faced it. Behind it, a man stood with his back to her, watching the storm without expression, a tumbler of unpoured whiskey in one hand. He was tall, taller than she had pictured, 6'2" at least, with the lean shoulders of a man who rode crew in some other life. His white dress shirt was rolled to the elbows, and on his left forearm a long, pale scar ran from wrist to inner elbow like a second vein. $40,000 of bespoke tailoring could not hide it. He did not seem to care that it could not. He did not turn. Elizabeth crossed the white marble. She set her hands at her sides. She did not let them shake. Then she did the thing she had practiced. She lowered herself to her knees in the center of the floor. She drew her hair back from her throat with both hands and tilted her chin up, baring the line of her neck to the room. "I have written my will, Mr. Sterling," she said. "It is in a drawer in Queens. My father knows nothing. Whatever you need to do it to me. Let him go." The man at the window went very still. Then he turned. His face was not the face of any criminal she had ever imagined. He looked, she thought absurdly, like a visiting fellow from the philosophy department, clean-shaven jaw, dark hair cut close, gray-blue eyes the color of weathered slate. He could have lectured on Kant in the morning and ordered a body buried by lunch, and neither would have wrinkled his collar. His eyes found her face first. Then they slid lower past her chin, past the hollow of her throat, and stopped. On the silver paper crane resting against her collarbone, he went so still she could hear the rain. When he finally moved, it was only to pour himself 2 fingers of whiskey from the crystal decanter on his desk. The tumbler clinked once against the neck of the bottle. His hand, she would not realize until much later, had trembled. "Stand up," he said. His voice was low, flat, and entirely changed from the voice he had used 3 seconds before. "I don't kill women in my office, Miss Bennett." She rose on legs that did not quite belong to her. He set the whiskey down without drinking it. He pressed a small chrome button on the underside of his desk. "Cancel the Genoa group meeting," he said into the intercom. "Cancel everything next week." A voice answered, "Sir, the Genoa contracts close on cancel them." He released the button. He sat down. He looked at her, and he looked at her, and the looking went on for longer than any man's professional curiosity could explain. "Your full name, Miss Bennett. Elizabeth Ann Bennett." Ethan Sterling closed his eyes. When he opened them, something behind them had been decided. "Then sit down, Miss Bennett," he said. "You and I need to talk about an arrangement." Elizabeth lowered herself into the leather chair across from him because her knees no longer trusted themselves to a standing position. Ethan Sterling did not speak for nearly a full minute. He reached into the top drawer of the walnut desk and withdrew a thick folder bound in oxblood leather. The embossed crest on the cover read, in small gold serif, Pierce, Whitmore, and Sterling LLP. He set the folder squarely between them, aligned its edges with the grain of the wood, and turned it so that the spine faced her. Every movement was deliberate, almost surgical, like a man diffusing a device he had built himself. "Before you say anything," he said, "I want you to understand that I am not asking for your life tonight. I am offering a different transaction. You may listen, and you may refuse, and if you refuse, you walk out of this building. Your father will not be harmed for your refusal. You have my word on that, and my word is the only currency in this room that matters." She did not believe him, but she nodded. He opened the folder. 24 months, he said. A marriage. Civil, registered, legally binding under the laws of the state of New York. In exchange for your signature on these documents, 3 things happen tonight. Your father walks out of the warehouse he is currently being held in. He is flown, before sunrise, to a private residence in Naples, Florida, where a medical team is already on retainer. The $12 million debt against him is dissolved on Sterling Holdings' letterhead before the close of business tomorrow. Elizabeth's mouth went dry. "Why?" she said. It came out as a word, not a question. "Because I am pursuing a gaming license," Ethan answered. He did not look down at the folder. He looked at her. A $2.4 billion resort in Atlantic City. The State Ethics Commission requires a clean public profile. Reformed family man. Stable household. Wife of unimpeachable character. They want a photograph for the front page of the Times business section, and they want it before March. You could hire an actress. I could. A model. A consultant. A pageant winner from Connecticut. I could, he repeated. He lifted the whiskey he still had not tasted, considered it. set it down again. But a woman who has walked into this building tonight, prepared to be shot for her father. They will not sell my name to a tabloid for $50,000 8 months from now. That is not character. That is structure. Structure cannot be bought from a casting agency. It was a clean answer. It was also, she sensed without being able to name how, not the answer. He turned the documents toward her and slid a Mont Blanc rollerball across the wood. You will reside primarily at the Sterling estate in East Hampton. You will appear publicly at my side at events I designate galas, hearings, and select press appearances. You may continue your studies at Columbia. You will not travel beyond the state of New York without a security detail assigned by my office. The financial provisions are on page 11, and they are generous. She turned to page 11. The number she saw there did not register as money. It registered as the weight of a different life, one she was not entitled to. He uncapped the pen, drew a clean horizontal line on the blank line of clause 7, and wrote 3 sentences in his own hand. She read them upside down. Party A shall make no demand upon Party B of a physical or intimate nature. Any contact between the parties shall require Party B's unambiguous and freely given consent. Breach of this provision shall void the contract in Party B's favor without penalty. He turned the page so she could read it the right way. I do not coerce women, Miss Bennet. The signature you give me tonight is a signature on a legal arrangement. Nothing more, unless you choose otherwise. And you may never choose otherwise. That clause does not expire. She read it twice. Her eyes blurred on the second reading. She picked up the pen. Her hand was shaking so badly that the first stroke of the E in her name skidded across the page like a bird hitting a window. She steadied her wrist against the edge of the desk, forced the rest of the letters out, and watched her own signature appear as a small, crooked confession at the bottom of the page. Ethan signed beneath her in a single elegant motion. He closed the folder. Then he stood, came around the desk, and lifted a small black velvet box from where he had left it earlier. He did not present the ring. He took her left hand in his gently, as if he had asked her permission already, and received it, and slid the cold platinum band over her knuckle. His fingertips brushed the inside of her left wrist on the way back. He went still. Beneath his thumb, half hidden by the cuff of her sleeve, was a faint pale crescent the size of a child's fingernail, an old burn scar she had never been able to explain, a scar she did not remember earning. His eyes lifted to her face. He did not ask. He frowned, very slightly, and let her hand go. A car will be at your apartment at 8 in the morning, he said. His voice once again, the voice of the man who had turned at the window. Pack 1 suitcase. You will not need anything else. He paused at the office door. Welcome to the Sterling family, Mrs. Sterling. 3 days after Elizabeth signed her name on the inside of an oxblood folder, she became Mrs. Sterling in a room that smelled of furniture polish and old paper. The wedding was held in the chambers of Judge Edward Hollings, a silver-haired jurist in Westchester County, whose campaign fund, she would later learn, had been quietly fattened by Sterling Holdings for the better part of a decade. There were no flowers on the desk, no music in the corridor, no photographer waiting in the wings. The American flag in the corner of the chambers had been dusted that morning, and that small courtesy was the only ceremonial detail anyone had thought to provide. The single witness arrived 4 minutes late. Victor Sterling was 58 years old, broad in the shoulders, and carried himself with the easy bonhomie of a man who had never once been told no in his own home. He wore a navy 3-piece, a pocket square the color of dried blood, and a smile that arrived at the room a half-second before he did. He kissed Elizabeth on both cheeks before she had decided whether to extend her hand. "My dear," he said, gripping her shoulder with a hand that was warmer than she expected. "Welcome, welcome, beautiful niece. This family has been waiting for a fresh breeze for far too long." Something low in her stomach tightened. She could not have explained why. The instinct arrived without paperwork, the way animals know weather. The ceremony took 14 minutes by the brass clock on the judge's wall. When Hollings spoke the words, "Do you take this woman?" Ethan answered, "I do," without hesitation, without inflection, and without taking his eyes from her face. There was no smile. The kiss at the end was the touch of his mouth to the center of her forehead, dry, brief, formal as a notarized seal. Outside, the rain had stopped. A black Bentley waited at the curb. The drive to East Hampton took 90 minutes through a corridor of bare November oaks. Neither of them spoke. Ethan worked on a tablet in the seat beside her, occasionally underlining figures with the flat of his thumb. The Sterling estate appeared at the end of a private road, lined with pines that had been planted by his grandfather. Gray stone, Gothic revival, built in 1923 for an oil heiress whose name no longer appeared on any deed in the county. The perimeter wall stood 13 feet high. Thermal cameras swiveled at the gateposts as the car approached. Beyond the wall, the Atlantic was a flat, gunmetal plate, stretched to the horizon and freezing at its edges. The front doors opened before the Bentley stopped. Eleanor Whitlock was 60 years old, narrow at the waist, broad through the cheekbones, and wore her steel-gray hair pulled back with the severity of a nun who had given up on God but not on order. Her eyes performed an inventory of Elizabeth in 3 seconds. Coat, posture, ring finger, throat, and registered no verdict that flattered her. Mr. Sterling, Miss Bennet. She did not correct herself. Ethan corrected nothing. Elizabeth was shown to the east wing through a corridor that measured nearly 200 feet. Her suite was 5 times the size of the apartment above the Greek bakery on Steinway Street. A private balcony overlooked the dunes. A fireplace had been lit 30 minutes before her arrival. The walk-in closet had been stocked with clothing in her exact measurements, arranged by season, and the silk slips at the back of the drawer had been folded by a hand that knew her bra size before she had told anyone in this house. She stood in the closet for a long minute and understood, with a quiet, electric clarity, that Ethan Sterling had begun preparing this room before the night she walked into his office. She did not yet understand why. That evening she ate alone at a small table near her window. Eleanor brought a tray. Eleanor did not curtsy. Eleanor did not stay. At 9, Elizabeth was permitted a monitored call. The line connected with a small click, and her father's voice came through it warm and broken. Lizzie, what did you do? She had rehearsed the lie all afternoon. I found a lawyer, Dad. A good one. Pro bono, Howard pulled in a favor. Sterling Holdings is dropping the complaint. I am safe. You are safe. Please, sleep. He cried for a while. She listened to him cry. She did not cry back. She had decided, somewhere on the drive from Westchester, that the next time she cried it would be alone. The line ended at 9:14. She did not undress. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed in her wedding suit and watched the platinum band on her finger catch the fire from the hearth. The metal was cold. It had been cold for 3 days. At 2 in the morning, she heard the heavy door at the far end of the west wing open and close. Ethan was home. What she did not know, what she would not know for many weeks, was that he had spent the 4 hours before that door latch sitting alone in his study with the lights off, a tumbler of untouched whiskey at his elbow, looking down at a creased black and white photograph in his palm. The photograph showed a 12-year-old girl holding the hand of a young man whose left shoulder had been burned to the bone. Behind them, a house was on fire. The first 14 days inside the Sterling estate taught Elizabeth that a cage did not need bars to function. It only needed a schedule. Ethan's car left the gates at 5:30 every morning. By the time she came down for breakfast at 7, his coffee cup had already been cleared, his chair pushed back into perfect alignment, and the only proof he had been in the house at all was a faint trace of bergamot in the corridor outside his study. He returned after midnight. She knew because she had started counting the gravel under the tires of the Maybach from her balcony, and the count was always the same: 18 seconds from the gate to the carriage house, 3 minutes from there to the closing of the west wing door. They ate together once a week. Sunday, 8 o'clock, formal dining room, the table 40 feet long and laid for 2 at opposite ends. The porcelain was Limoges, the candlesticks were Georgian silver, and the only sound across those 40 feet was the small civilized music of cutlery meeting plate. He asked her 3 questions per dinner. Are you comfortable? Do you require anything? How are your studies? She answered in 3 sentences. The food was excellent. Neither of them tasted it. Her Columbia courses had been quietly transferred online before she arrived at the estate. A private tutor with a non-disclosure agreement 4 pages long came twice a week to tutor her through structural mechanics. She was not permitted past the front gate without Connor Reed. Connor was 33, 6'1", and built like a man who had spent 8 years convincing the United States Navy that he could swim further than its insurance department was comfortable with. He spoke in short, complete sentences, and his eyes never quite stopped moving. When she went to the bookstore in Sag Harbor, he stood at the end of the aisle. When she walked the dunes, he walked 4 paces behind her on the leeward side. He never asked what she was reading. He never volunteered why he was there. On the morning of the 11th day, she took a wrong turn coming out of the breakfast room and found herself in the west wing. The corridor was darker than her own. The runner under her feet was navy instead of charcoal. Connor materialized at her elbow within seconds, as if he had been folded into the wall and was only now stepping out of it. Mrs. Sterling. This section is not in your access plan." His voice was perfectly courteous. It also left no margin. She turned to retreat. As she turned, her eye caught the half-open door of Ethan's private study at the far end of the corridor. Through the gap, in the deep gold light of a desk lamp left on overnight, she saw a large oil painting on the far wall. A young woman with dark brown hair was seated against a Tuscan landscape. Her mouth was lifted in a small private smile. Her hands rested in her lap, folded around a silver chain. The angle of the woman's cheekbones, the line of her jaw, the slight inward tilt of the left shoulder. Elizabeth stopped breathing for 2 full seconds. The woman in the painting was not her mother. Margaret Bennett had been blonde, freckled, and had laughed with her whole face. The woman in the painting laughed with only her eyes, and her hair was a darker auburn, and the resemblance to Elizabeth herself was not a copy, it was a rhyme. Connor cleared his throat. She returned to the East Wing without looking back. That night she did not sleep. She lay in the dark and inventoried what she knew of her mother. Margaret had been born in Brooklyn to Polish parents. She had worked as a paralegal at a small immigration firm in Sunset Park. She had married David Bennett at 26. She had died of pancreatic cancer at 38, the year Elizabeth turned 8, on a Tuesday in March, in a hospice room that smelled of lemon polish. The woman in the painting was not her mother, but somewhere, somehow, they had walked across the same field of resemblance. On the morning of the 14th day, Eleanor came into her room without knocking and laid a long garment bag across the foot of the bed. "Saturday evening you will attend the winter benefit at the Metropolitan Museum. Mr. Sterling has requested that you be ready in the foyer at 6. The car leaves at 6:12. She left without waiting for an answer. At 11 that night, the in-house phone on Elizabeth's bedside table rang. The number was internal. Only 6 people in the household had access to it. She lifted the receiver. A man's voice, middle-aged, careful, slightly hoarse from cigarettes. "Elizabeth Bennett. You don't know me, but I knew your mother. Be careful what you see in that house. Ask your husband about the night of June 14th, 2014. Ask him." The line went dead. She set the receiver down, walked into the bathroom, turned on the light over the mirror. She pushed her right sleeve up to the elbow. On the inside of her wrist, a small pale crescent the size of a child's fingernail caught the light. A burn scar she had carried since she was 12 and had never, in her entire life, been able to remember earning. Saturday arrived faster than the question Elizabeth had not yet been brave enough to ask. At 5:58 in the evening, she came down the grand staircase of the Sterling estate in a floor-length wine silk gown that had been chosen for her by a stylist she had never met. A Cartier diamond Riviere sat against her collarbones, on loan from a vault she had not been told the address of. Beneath the silk, hidden against her sternum where the necklace could not crowd it, the small silver paper crane rested where it had rested every day of her life. Ethan was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Black Brioni tuxedo, hands at his sides. The mask he had worn through 14 breakfasts had been polished for the evening like a piece of armor. When her foot left the 3rd step from the bottom, the mask slipped. His eyes traveled the length of her, the gown, the throat, the shape of her shoulders inside the cut of the silk with an intensity that did not look like appreciation. It looked like a man holding his breath against a wound. The expression lasted half a second. He smoothed it away before her foot reached the floor. "We leave now," he said. The flashes began before the Maybach door had finished opening. A double line of photographers ran the length of the Metropolitan Museum's red carpet, and the moment Elizabeth's heel touched the runner, the cameras erupted into a wall of white noise. Ethan's right hand settled at the small of her back, possessive, faintly tight. A public claim, and as he guided her up the steps, he leaned down and spoke into her hair, his lips barely moving. "Smile. Stay within 3 meters of me. Do not accept a drink from any hand that is not mine or Connor's." She smiled. She stayed. Inside the Great Hall, the social architecture of New York reorganized itself around them. A senator's wife in emerald complimented her dress. A real estate billionaire whose name she recognized from her father's old newspaper kissed the air beside her cheek. A museum trustee with a German accent asked Ethan whether the rumored Atlantic City project would be ready for a soft opening by autumn. Then a hand the color of old paper closed gently around Ethan's elbow. "My boy." Senator Harrison Pierce was 62 years old. His silver hair had been combed back with the precision of a campaign poster. His tuxedo was Tom Ford. His cufflinks were quiet gold, and his smile was a thing he had practiced in mirrors for 40 years until it could be deployed without thought. He embraced Ethan with the easy, paternal authority of a man who had stood at his godson's high school graduation and meant to be photographed doing it again at his inauguration. "Ethan, my son. And this must be the bride I have been hearing so much about." He turned to Elizabeth. He lifted her hand to his mouth in the old European fashion. His lips did not actually touch her skin, but his eyes did. They traveled, in a single unhurried sweep, from her face down to her throat past the Cartier diamonds and stopped, for what could not have been more than 3/10 of a second, on the place where a faint silver chain disappeared beneath the silk. The smile on Pierce's face did not change. The temperature behind it did. Elizabeth felt a cold travel down the column of her spine that no champagne would ever warm. She had no idea what she had just been recognized for. She knew only that she had, somehow, been counted. She slipped her hand free, murmured something polite, and moved toward the bar. Half an hour later, when Ethan was pulled aside by a member of the New Jersey Casino Control Commission, a man in a gray suit detached himself from a column near the orchestra and crossed the floor toward her. He was perhaps 45, narrow at the jaw, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested either money or a recent parole hearing. He picked up a flute of champagne from the table and held it out to her with 2 fingers. "Mrs. Sterling. A drink?" She did not take it. He smiled anyway. "Do you know how many men your husband ordered killed last month?" 11. "Do you know what your father actually is in this story? Because I promise you, Mrs. Sterling, you do not." She did not move. He leaned closer. His voice dropped beneath the orchestra. "Ask your husband about the fire on Riverside Drive. Ask him why the 12-year-old girl who pulled him out of it has been erased from every police record in this city. You think you signed a contract? Sweetheart, you signed a leash you cannot see." A hand closed on the man's shoulder. Ethan's voice arrived before his body did. "Doyle, you are going to take 3 steps away from my wife in the next 3 seconds, or I will walk you out of this building myself, and you will not be returning to the surface of the Hudson before Easter." Marcus Doyle smiled, set the champagne flute down with theatrical care, and walked away. The Maybach drove south along 5th Avenue at 11:46 that night. Elizabeth pressed her trembling hands flat against the silk in her lap and did not look at her husband. In her head, 3 pieces were already turning toward each other. Riverside Drive, June 14th, 2014. A 12-year-old girl. In 2014, she had been 12 years old. The privacy partition rose between them and the driver as the Maybach turned onto the Long Island Expressway. Inside the cabin, the world dropped to absolute silence, the cushioned, vacuum-sealed silence of a vault designed for conversations no one was meant to overhear. Ethan poured himself a measure of whiskey from the built-in decanter and did not offer her one. He stared out the tinted window at the river of red taillights heading east into the dark. Elizabeth turned toward him on the leather bench. Her trembling had stopped somewhere between the museum steps and the bridge, and what replaced it was a steadier, sharper thing, the same flat clarity that had once carried her into the lobby of Sterling Tower. "You know my father is innocent, don't you?" He did not turn. A full minute passed before his answer found her in the dark. "I do." The word landed somewhere in the center of her chest and stayed there. "You knew," she said. "You knew, and you let them take him. You let them photograph him tied to a chair. You let me write a farewell letter in a drawer in Queens. You sat across a desk from me, and you watched me sign my life over for 24 months, and you knew." Yes, she had expected an excuse. The flatness of his agreement was worse. "If I had refused you in that office, you would not have walked out of that building alive. Not because of me, because the man who actually wanted your father dead has people in my organization. Elizabeth. He has had them for years. If I had not signed the warrant on David Bennett myself, someone less careful would have. And by less careful, I mean someone who would have killed him in the warehouse Tuesday night, photographed the body, and mailed the picture to your apartment by Friday." He turned toward her, finally. In the dim cabin light, his eyes were 2 small, sharp panels of weathered metal. "There is a traitor inside Sterling Holdings. Someone forged the customs seal on your father's container. Someone signed his name to a handoff log with the precision of a man who has been planning to bury him for months. I do not yet know who. I will know. But until I do, the only place on this planet where David Bennett is genuinely safe is inside a perimeter that belongs to me. And the only place where you are safe is inside the name Sterling." She was breathing hard, and she could not tell at what point her breathing had become hard. "Then I am not your wife. I am a hostage you have rebranded. You are my wife, and you are also alive. Tonight those 2 things require each other. I don't believe you." He was quiet for a long beat. "There are things tonight I am not able to explain to you," he said, very softly. "But I will swear to you on Sterling blood, And that vow has cost 3 generations of my family more than it has cost yours. That I am not your enemy. I am not your father's enemy. Whatever else I become to you, I will not become that." She pushed harder. She could not stop pushing. Doyle said 2014. He said Riverside Drive. He said a 12-year-old girl. What is that? His hand on the whiskey tumbler tightened so slowly that she watched each knuckle go white in sequence. "That," he said, "is the night I lost my family." The car kept moving. The world outside the window peeled past in long horizontal smears of orange sodium. "Your mother," she whispered. "My mother died in the fire. They identified her by her wedding ring." He paused, and the next sentence came out of him with the deliberate flatness of a man reading from a coroner's report he had memorized. "My father was never found. They recovered his watch from the ash. They never recovered his body. I was 26 years old that night. The newspaper said I was lucky. They said I escaped." His eyes lifted to hers. They were lying. "I did not escape." "Then how did you get out?" "I was pulled out. By a child. A girl of about 12. The silver crane against her sternum had gone suddenly, impossibly warm against her skin. I was half conscious when she reached me. The smoke had taken most of my air, and the beam that came down on my shoulder had taken most of my left arm. I could not see her face. I remember the weight of her hands on my collar. I remember her dragging me across the gravel of the driveway with strength a child that size should not have had, and I remember at the end she pressed something small and metallic into my palm. And then she ran. She was gone before the first fire engine turned onto the street. He stopped. He looked at her in the dark. "I have been looking for that girl for 10 years, Elizabeth. 10 years. The wheels of the Maybach slowed. She had not formed the next question yet. "What did she give you? What was the metallic thing? Was it shaped like a bird when the chassis dipped over the threshold of the Sterling gates, and the headlights swept across the gravel of the carriage house?" Ethan opened his door himself. He stepped out into the cold without waiting for the chauffeur. He walked toward the house without once looking back at her. She sat alone in the dark of the cabin. Her right hand had found the silver chain through the wine silk of her gown, and her fingers had closed around the small folded bird as though it were the last living thing inside the car. She fell asleep in the wine silk gown. The dream came the way it always came, uninvited, fully formed, complete in its details. Cobblestones, wet and uneven under the soles of small shoes. Smoke that was not the smoke of a campfire, but something darker, something that smelled of varnish and human hair. A wrought iron gate hanging open, half melted at the hinge, and on the gravel of a driveway lit by something orange that was not the sun, a figure was lying on its side. In every previous version of the dream, the figure had been a shape only long limbs, a dark shirt, the suggestion of a face she could never quite resolve. Tonight the face resolved. He was not a boy. He was a young man, 25 or 26, with blood matting his temple to his jaw, and the left shoulder of his shirt burned through to flesh that was the color of charred bark. His eyes, the eyes she had never, in 100 repetitions of this dream, been able to see, were open. They were gray-blue. They looked at her. She woke at 4 a.m. with the silk of her gown twisted under her ribs and her hair stuck to her forehead with cold sweat. The fire in the hearth had collapsed to red coal. The ocean outside the balcony was making a long, low sound that was almost not a sound. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth understood that the dream had never been a nightmare. It had been a memory. She did not sleep again. She sat at the foot of the enormous bed and watched the gray of the Atlantic dawn arrive over the dunes inch by inch. And at 7:15 she lifted the monitored receiver and dialed the only number on the white card Eleanor had left on her nightstand. Her father picked up on the second ring. There was the small, thready cough of a man who had been sleeping in unfamiliar lungs. "Dad, I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, even if Mom told you not to." David Bennett went very quiet on the other end of the line. "Lizzie, what's wrong?" "The summer I was 12, 2014. Did something happen to me?" The silence on the line stretched long enough that she heard the small click of him swallowing. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because I am remembering, Dad, and I need to know if I am remembering or if I am inventing." He exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who had been waiting a decade for the question. There was a fire. The fingers of her left hand closed around the silver crane. "That summer," he said, "your mother took you uptown to visit her Aunt Margaret on West 89th. You and your mother were walking back toward the subway. There was a house on Riverside Drive, a big one, set back from the street, with the iron fence, and it was on fire. There were no engines yet. There were no people. You let go of your mother's hand, Lizzie. She told me you didn't say a word. You just ran. Into the house. Into the driveway. Your mother screamed your name. She told me she could not move her feet. By the time her legs worked again, you were dragging a young man across the gravel by the back of his collar. She did not understand how you were doing it. He was twice your size. She said you were not crying. She said you were not even breathing fast. She said you looked like you were doing arithmetic. Elizabeth's eyes had filled. She did not feel them fill. After the firefighters arrived, she pulled you away. She took you home through the park. She washed the soot off your face in the bathroom of our apartment. She said you went into shock somewhere between the West Side and Steinway Street. You slept for 40 hours. When you woke up, you did not remember any of it. The doctor said the mind protects itself. Your mother told me she made me swear that we would never speak of it again. She said the people in that house were dangerous people. She said the less you remembered, the safer you would be. Did she ever tell you the name? It was in the papers for a week. A wealthy family. The name was Sterling. She set the phone down on the floor very gently, as if it were a glass that might break. She did not remember crossing the room. She did remember pulling the rosewood box out of the bottom of her valley, the lacquer cold against her palms, the brass clasp stiff against her thumb. She opened it. The blank notebook was where it had always been. The original silver crane, the twin of the one that hung at her throat, lay in its small velvet groove. But beneath the lining of the lid, half tucked into the silk, was an envelope she had never opened. Cream paper, no address, her mother's handwriting along the flap. For Lizzie. When she remembers, the wax seal had hardened. Elizabeth broke it with her thumbnail. The note inside was a single folded page, written in Margaret Bennett's careful, slanting hand. My darling girl, if you are reading this, it means you have remembered. I am so sorry I could not be the one to tell you. There is a man in this city named Ethan Sterling. He owes you a life. Yours saved his. On a night neither of us was supposed to be on that street. He is the only person on this earth who can protect you from what I could not. When the time comes, find him. Trust the bird. I love you, Lizzie. I am sorry. I am sorry. Elizabeth sat down on the floorboards because her legs no longer held her. Her mother had known. Her mother had known everything. Sunday brought the first snow of the season, a slow, sideways drift that began before sunrise, and turned the dunes outside her balcony, the color of old bone by 10 in the morning. Elizabeth folded her mother's letter twice and slid it into the inside pocket of the cashmere cardigan she had not bothered to take off. She did not look at her face in any of the mirrors she passed in the East Wing. She did not need to. She knew what her face had become overnight, and she did not wish to confirm it. She walked the long corridor toward the West Wing with her hands in her pockets, and her chin held at the angle her mother had taught her to hold it at funerals. She knocked on Ethan's study door for the first time. The latch turned from the inside before her knuckles had finished their second strike. He was already standing somehow, expecting her in a charcoal sweater and unpressed slacks. No jacket, no tie, the cuffs of his sleeves pushed to his elbows. The faint scar along his left forearm caught the gray light of the snow through the window. He saw her face. He did not ask. She had rehearsed 7 openings on the walk through the corridor. She used none of them. Do you have a photograph of your mother? He did not answer for a long beat. Then he stepped aside and gestured into the corridor behind him. Come with me. The West Wing library occupied 2 stories. She had walked past its doors a dozen times and never been invited in. He opened them now with the small brass key he carried in his pocket, and the room that revealed itself smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and the wood smoke of a fireplace that had been lit before her knuckles had ever reached the study door, as though some part of the house had been waiting for this. Thousands of leather-bound spines climbed both walls to a wrought iron balcony. A pair of deep oxblood chairs faced the hearth. On the third shelf to the right of the mantel, separate from the books and turned toward the room, stood a single black and white photograph in a plain silver frame. A young woman with dark auburn hair smiled out of it. She was seated on a stone wall under what looked like Italian olive trees. In her lap, leaning against her shoulder with the careless trust of a 6-year-old, sat a small boy with gray-blue eyes she would have recognized in any decade of his life. My mother, Ethan said. Sofia Sterling, Italian, from a village outside Lucca. My father met her on a freight contract in 2003 and brought her back to New York within the same year. She did not speak English when she arrived. She learned it by reading detective novels to me at bedtime. Elizabeth bent her face closer to the photograph. The resemblance she had seen through the half-open door, the one that had kept her up for an entire night, dissolved on contact with the original. Sophia's cheekbones were her own, that was true. Their hair shared a color, But Sophia's eyes were dark, and her smile was wider, and her hands were the hands of a woman who had grown up pressing grapes. The likeness was a rhyme, not a copy, a coincidence of geometry. Whatever connected the two of them, it was not blood. They sat in the oxblood chairs facing the fire. Ethan poured 2 small glasses of something the color of dark honey from a decanter she had not noticed. He set one beside her without asking whether she wanted it. "My father was Marcus Sterling," he said. "He founded Sterling Holdings in 1988, with 3 boats and a warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront. He was a hard man. He was also, in his way, a kind one. He wanted out, Elizabeth. He had been wanting out for years. The month before the fire, he signed a cooperating witness agreement with the FBI. She felt the cardigan over her shoulders for the first time. She had not realized she was cold. "You think the fire was not an accident," she said. "I know it was not an accident. I have been looking for 10 years, and every time I have gotten close to a name, the man I was about to question has died first. Heart attacks, boating accidents, a retired arson investigator who fell in his bathtub in 2017. Whoever set the fire that night has spent a decade keeping the story buried with my father." His eyes moved to hers. "And now," he said, "someone is framing your father at a port my father used to operate. You do not think that is strange?" Her breath caught in the small hollow above her collarbone. "You think they're connected. My father, yours. I do not yet have proof, but David Bennett has worked at the Brooklyn Marine Terminal since 2010. The pier where his container was logged is Pier 12. Pier 12 was Sterling property until 2016. The terminal was overseen, in 2010, by my father personally. The snow had thickened against the windows. The library had grown very still." Elizabeth shivered, and she did not know whether it was the temperature of the room or the geometry of what he had just placed in front of her. Ethan stood. He took down a heavy wool throw from the back of his chair, walked the 3 steps to her side, and settled it across her shoulders. His hand stayed at the curve of her shoulder for one breath, longer than the act required. When she looked up, the man behind those gray-blue eyes was not the man who had slid a velvet box across a walnut desk 20 days ago. He was not the man at the foot of a staircase, or the hand at the small of her back on a red carpet, or the silhouette behind a partition in a Maybach. He was, she understood with a small, soft shock, a man who had been alone for a very long time. A week after the snow fell on the library windows, an email arrived in Elizabeth's Columbia inbox that she had been waiting for since September. The Cooper Hewitt Museum was hosting its annual graduate showcase. Her senior thesis project, a residential complex designed around an Atlantic coastal floodplain, had been accepted into the architecture wing. The opening reception was scheduled for the following Thursday at 6 in the evening. She brought the invitation to Ethan over Sunday dinner. He read it twice, in the long candlelight of the dining hall. It is a public space with 30 exits and no controlled perimeter. It is also the only thing I have done in my life that I am proud of. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he folded the email and slid it back across the table to her. "Connor will be inside the building. 2 additional men in the street. You will not leave Connor's eye line for the duration. Are we agreed?" "We are agreed." Thursday came. She wore a slate-gray dress, low-heeled boots, a wool coat over her arm, and the silver crane tucked once again beneath her collar. Connor drove her into Manhattan himself. The 2 additional men trailed the SUV in an unmarked Suburban 2 car lengths back. The museum was warm with the small, bright noise of graduate students who had not yet learned to be afraid of anything. Her thesis advisor hugged her. A professor from the historic preservation track hugged her. And then, beside the cantilevered model of her floodplain complex, a small voice said her name, and Sarah Kim was standing there with a glass of bad white wine and a smile Elizabeth had not seen in 5 months. They talked about nothing for 15 minutes. It was the closest thing to her old life she had touched since November. Sarah excused herself to find the bathroom. Elizabeth followed 2 minutes later. Connor's eyes tracked her across the gallery floor, registered the destination, and nodded once. She was inside the women's bathroom for 4 minutes. She came out into a service corridor at 3 minutes past 7. The lights cut. The fire alarm did not sound like a fire alarm. It sounded like the cheap secondary system that older Manhattan buildings used when their main circuit was tripped from somewhere outside the building. The gallery beyond the corridor erupted in the small, bright panic of well-dressed people heading for what they assumed were the exits. A gloved hand closed over Elizabeth's mouth from behind. Another hand caught her around the ribs and lifted her bodily off the floor. And a third person there were already 3 of them. She had not even heard them, was opening the service stairwell door at the end of the corridor with the speed of a man who had walked the route in daylight. A voice with a thick Eastern European accent said, in her ear, "Move. There is a car at the back door." The stairwell door closed behind them with a soft pneumatic hush. 2 flights down, the man in front of her was lifted off his feet by a sound she did not hear. He folded forward across the railing without a cry. A second sound followed half a heartbeat later, and the man holding her ribs let her go and slid down the concrete wall, leaving a long, dark smear behind him. Connor was at the top of the stairs, a suppressed cig in both hands, descending 2 steps at a time. The third man, the one with the glove still on her mouth, twisted Elizabeth in front of him and pressed the barrel of his pistol into her right temple. The metal was cold. Connor stopped on the 4th step from the landing. His left shoulder was bleeding through his suit jacket in a slow, expanding circle. He did not lower his weapon. He raised it to a position from which he could not, with any honest geometry, fire at the man behind her without going through her first. He did not fire. Behind her, the man's breathing was loud and shallow. He said something in his own language. Then, in English, "Move, both of you, down." The fire door at the bottom of the stairs banged open. Ethan Sterling came through it. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a black leather coat over a Kevlar vest, and he was carrying 2 matte black Glock 19s, and he had moved through the lower levels of the building so quickly that the air behind him had not yet caught up with him. He had been on his way in before Connor's emergency signal had reached the second sentence. He did not speak. He did not pause to assess. A single round left the muzzle of his right pistol. It passed close enough to the corner of Elizabeth's jaw that she felt the heat of it on her skin, and it entered the forehead of the man behind her, at a height that suggested the shooter had measured both their statures in advance. The hand on her mouth released. The body fell backward without taking her with it. Her knees gave. Ethan caught her before she struck the concrete. He lowered her into a half-crouch against the stairwell wall and ran his hands across her face, her throat, her shoulders, her ribs, with the swift, professional thoroughness of a man who had been preparing himself for this exact triage for the entire drive into Manhattan. "Are you hurt? Liz. Look at me. Liz." It was the first time he had used the short version of her name. "I'm not hurt," she said. Her voice came out somewhere far above her body. Connor, as I'm fine, sir," Connor said from the stairs above them. He had not lowered his weapon. He had kept it trained on the bend in the staircase in case the third man had a fourth friend. Through the muscle. Clean. Get her out. Ethan lifted her off the concrete in one motion. He carried her along the service hall, through a kitchen prep area, past 2 Cooper Hewitt staff members who were already pressed flat against a wall with their hands over their mouths, and out into a narrow loading bay where a black armored Suburban was idling with its rear door open. He set her into the back seat. He climbed in beside her. The door slammed. His mouth was against her temple, and his breath was uneven, and he was speaking into her hair in the low, private voice she had not heard before tonight. "They found you. Sooner than I thought. We disappear tonight, Liz. Tonight." The Suburban left Manhattan at 7:46 and crossed into Connecticut before Elizabeth could feel her hands again. Ethan had a phone pressed to his ear for the first hour, speaking in clipped half-sentences to people whose names she did not catch. "Go dark on the Hampton line. Pull the secondary detail from Naples. I want eyes on her father by midnight." He did not let go of her left hand at any point during the call. He kept her fingers folded inside his on the leather between them, the way a man might hold the wrist of someone he was afraid to lose to shock. They turned off the interstate 3 hours north of Manhattan, onto a county road that climbed in long switchbacks into snow-blanketed forest. The headlights of the Suburban swept across pines bent under the weight of late November snow. They passed no other cars. The safe house sat at the top of the rise, a stone and timber lodge built in 1890, the kind of New England retreat that magazines photographed for their fall issues. From the outside, it looked like a place where a senator might write a memoir. The windows, Elizabeth noticed, were 4 panes deep and tinted faintly green. The generator hummed somewhere underground. There were no power lines coming in. Dr. Aaron Mendoza arrived at 3 in the morning in a salt-streaked Range Rover. He was 60, mustached, calm in the way only retired military doctors are calm. He cleaned the small abrasion on Elizabeth's right palm in 2 minutes and pronounced her medically uninteresting. He spent 40 minutes in the kitchen with Connor, debriding the entry and exit wounds in his shoulder, irrigating the channel with saline, packing it, and stitching the skin closed in a quick, neat ladder. At 4:15 the doctor left. Connor took a glass of water and a sedative and went upstairs to sleep. The two backup guards rotated outside in the snow. Ethan and Elizabeth were alone in the great room with the fire. She was still wearing the slate gray dress. She had been holding the wool throw closed against her chest for an hour without realizing it. The trembling had not stopped. It had only moved out of her hands, deeper, into the muscles along her ribs. She reached into the pocket of the cardigan she had thrown on over the dress on the way out of the museum, and she drew out the folded cream paper she had carried against her body for 9 days. She handed her mother's letter to her husband. Ethan read it once, then read it a second time, slowly, his thumb passing over the words "trust the bird" twice before his eyes lifted. "Your mother knew me," he said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that was not calm. "My mother knew you. My father knew about the fire. He has known for 10 years. Her own voice did not sound like hers. "I was the girl, Ethan. The girl in your driveway. I was 12 years old. I was walking back to the subway with my mother." She lifted her hands behind her neck and unclasped the chain. She let the silver bird fall onto her open palm. She held the palm out toward him. He did not take it. He stood up instead, and crossed the room to a tall walnut cabinet in the corner. He laid his thumb against a small pad set into the inner edge of the door. The lock disengaged with a soft electronic chirp. He withdrew a black velvet box no larger than a deck of cards. He carried it back to the fire and sat down across from her. He opened the lid. Inside, on a small square of black silk, lay a second silver paper crane. The wings of this one were dented. One of the folded edges had been bent inward by a force that looked like the weight of a man's fist on stairs. The chain attached to it had been broken and resoldered by a jeweler somewhere very expensive. 10 years, Ethan said. 4 private investigators. Photographs of every 12-year-old girl in every Manhattan school registry between 2012 and 2015. 6 orphanages, 3 custodial registries. I did not know your name. I did not know your face. The only thing I had of you was this. He closed his hand around both birds. The 2 small silver bodies disappeared inside his palm. "When you walked into my office last month," he said, "I recognized you the second you opened the collar of your coat. I almost went to my knees in front of my own desk." She was crying. She had not noticed beginning. There was no sound to it. The tears simply moved down her face the way the snow outside was moving down the windows, steady, vertical, beyond her will. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Why did you make me sign a contract? Because if I had told you the truth that night, you would not have believed me. You were a 22-year-old paralegal student staring at the man who had ordered your father's arrest. You would have spat on the floor and walked out, and you would have been dead in a doorway in Queens before breakfast." He set the velvet box on the low table between them. "The person who set the fire 10 years ago is still in this city. He has spent a decade hunting every witness who could put him in front of a federal jury. There were 3 witnesses to that night, Elizabeth. A retired arson investigator who fell in his bathtub, a coroner's assistant who drowned off Montauk, and a 12-year-old girl who walked back to a subway with her mother and lived. He has been looking for that girl as long as I have. The only difference is that he wanted to bury her, and I wanted to thank her." He got up from his chair. He crossed the few feet between them. He went down on one knee in front of her by the fire. "I owe you my life, Elizabeth. I swore on the night you ran out of my driveway that if I ever found that girl again, I would give her anything she asked for. I cannot give you what I owe you. I lost the right to settle that debt clean about a week ago. I have fallen in love with you." She did not answer in words. She leaned forward. Their mouths met in the firelight, not the press of a stage kiss for cameras, not the formality of a vow in a judge's chambers, but the slow, careful collision of 2 people who had walked toward each other from opposite ends of 10 years and finally arrived in the same room. The kiss did not end where it began. It deepened by degrees Elizabeth did not consciously authorize. Her hand had moved from his jaw to the back of his neck. Her body had angled forward off the chair. The wool throw had slipped from her shoulders to the rug, and somewhere along the way the room became a smaller room, and the fire became the only light in it, and the silence between his breath and hers became the loudest thing in the lodge. He was the one who broke it. He pulled back by an inch and pressed his forehead to hers. His eyes were closed. His hand had come to rest at the base of her throat, just above the silver chain. Liz. Her name in his mouth had a new weight to it. Not a contract weight. Not the careful, formal weight of the man at the foot of a staircase. Something rawer. Clause 7 of the contract is still in force. Every word of it. You owe me nothing tonight. You owe me nothing any night. If you stand up right now and walk into the other bedroom, I will close that door for you myself, and I will not knock on it. She lifted her face. Ethan. Her voice was quiet, but it was steady. I am not doing this because of a piece of paper in your desk. Do you think I cannot tell the difference? He looked at her for a long beat. Whatever he had been holding in reserve since the moment he had turned at the window of his office on the 47th floor, he let it go. They moved into the bedroom together. The fire there had been laid hours earlier by someone who would never be asked about it. The bed was wide, and the linen was Belgian, and the down comforter had been turned back at one corner, as if for a guest who had been expected for a very long time. The lamps were already low. He turned them lower. What happened next did not happen quickly. It happened the way two people move when each of them is afraid of breaking what they have only just been allowed to hold. Skin warmed against skin, breath caught in the dark, the wool of his sweater, the silk of her dress, the cold metal of two paper cranes on a single nightstand, firelight on the long pale line of a 10-year-old scar, a single quiet sound that was not quite a word, repeated. Time, for the first time since she had been 12 years old, behaved. Afterward, the snow outside the windows had thickened to a slow vertical drift, and the only sound in the room was the small contented work of the fire. She lay with her head against his chest. His left arm was wrapped around her shoulders. With one fingertip she traced the pale, raised constellation of burn scar that ran from his collarbone down to the curve of his shoulder, the shape of a beam. She realized, the same beam that had pinned him to the gravel of a Riverside Drive driveway on the night of June 14th, 2014. "Why did you go in?" he asked into her hair. "You were a child. You were 12. I don't remember thinking. I heard someone. I let go of my mother's hand. I ran." He was quiet for a long time. His hand moved slowly through her hair. "Your father is a good man, Liz. Whoever is framing him is playing a much older game than your father knows. I will find them." She lifted her head. "Ethan, there is something else. The night after the Met Gala, there was a phone call to the house line." He stilled beneath her. "On the internal line?" "On the internal line." A man's voice. Middle-aged. "He told me to ask you about June 14th, 2014. He said he knew my mother." He hung up before I could answer. He sat up against the headboard. The warmth around her shifted. So did his face. "Only 6 people in the world have access to that number," he said. 3 of them are on the security detail at the estate. One of them is Eleanor. One of them is my attorney. And one of them is my uncle. Did you recognize the voice? No. But I do not need to. The handoff log on your father's container last month was signed with my late father's pre-2014 signature stamp. The original of that stamp is in a sealed evidence box in my office. 3 people on this planet have ever had access to that box. He looked at her, me, my head of legal, and my uncle Victor. The silence that followed had the dense, flat quality of an ice sheet. He reached for the secure phone on the nightstand. He held the screen to his eye. The line opened on the second tone. "Liam, wake up. I want every minute of the camera footage from Warehouse 7 for the 72 hours surrounding the Bennett seal forgery. Audio 2. Cross-reference against Victor's biometric logins for the same window. Do not log the request in the central system. Run it on the private server in Boston. I want eyes on it before sunrise." He listened for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I think we have been betrayed from inside this family." He set the phone down. He drew her back against him under the comforter, and they did not speak again until the sky outside the windows began to gray. The Berkshire sun came in low and white across the snow, and Elizabeth woke alone to the small mechanical hum of a satellite phone 3 rooms away. The other side of the bed was already cold. A folded note on the pillow read, in Ethan's clean architectural hand, "Downstairs. Eat something. E." She sat up, drew the comforter around her shoulders, and her eyes settled on the small leather suitcase she had brought up from Manhattan the night before. The rosewood box was inside it, wrapped in one of her sweaters the way she had wrapped it every time she had moved apartments since she was 8. She lifted the box out. She set it on her lap. Something her mother had said to her on the night she was given it, buried for 11 years under all the other things 12-year-olds forget, surfaced suddenly with the cold clarity of the dream. "This is not just a box, Lizzie. It is a special box. When you are old enough, you will understand." Elizabeth turned it over in her hands. The bottom was lined with the same dark green velvet as the interior. The velvet had been glued at the 4 corners and along 3 of the 4 edges, but at the 4th edge, the back edge, the edge that always sat against the wall of whatever shelf the box had lived on the fabric, had been only lightly tacked. She slid her thumbnail under it. The velvet panel lifted away in her hand. Beneath it lay a shallow, recessed compartment she had carried with her for 11 years without knowing. 3 things rested inside. A small red USB stick, no bigger than her thumbnail, capped in matte plastic, a brass safe deposit key, old style, stamped along its shank with the words Vault, 14B, Chase Bank, Lexington Avenue, and a single photographic print, the color faded to a soft amber the way film prints fade when they have been kept out of light for a long time. She picked up the photograph. 2 women stood in a sunlit garden somewhere with cypress trees in the background. The one on the left was her mother, perhaps 30 years old. In a sundress, Elizabeth had never seen Margaret Bennett with her hair down, laughing into the camera in a way Elizabeth had not seen her laugh since before the cancer. The woman on the right was Sophia Sterling. The 2 women were standing close enough that their shoulders touched. Sophia's arms were curled around a small, swaddled infant, who slept against her collarbone with one tiny fist closed in the fabric of her blouse. Elizabeth's hand was unsteady before her mind had caught up to why. She nearly dropped the picture. She did not finish dressing. She came down the staircase of the Berkshires Lodge 2 at a time, in last night's slip and one of Ethan's wool sweaters, the photograph held flat between both her palms. He was in the small study off the kitchen. The satellite phone was on the desk. A laptop was open in front of him, with what looked like grainy warehouse footage paused mid-frame. She set the photograph on the keyboard. Over the footage, without saying a word, he looked down. He went very still. "That is my mother," he said. His voice had become small in a way she had not heard before. "And the woman next to her is yours." "Yes. The baby is me. 1990. The garden is Luca. That is the wall behind my grandmother's house." He sat back in the chair very slowly. "Our mothers knew each other," he said. "Our mothers were friends, Ethan. And mine never told me. Not once." She held up the brass key and the USB. He found a card reader in his go bag, plugged the USB into a sterile laptop he kept on a separate network, and opened the directory. There were 43 folders. The first was labeled SHLEDGER19952014. Inside were scans, dozens of them photographs of handwritten accounting pages in Sophia Sterling's small, careful Italian penmanship. They were not the books of a kitchen. They were the parallel books of Sterling Holdings, running back 19 years, every off-record wire, every cash transfer, every untracked freight invoice that Marcus Sterling had ever moved through the Brooklyn waterfront. And beside each illegal entry, in the receivable column, a single recurring code repeated like a heartbeat through 2 decades. HP, DC. Ethan read the code aloud once. Harrison Pierce, District of Columbia. He pressed his hands flat against the edge of the desk. My father was paying him. For 20 years, my father was paying him. She scrolled. The last folder in the directory was labeled with a single date, the 12th of June 2014, 2 days before the fire. It contained one file, a video. She clicked it. Sophia Sterling's face filled the screen. She was sitting at the kitchen table of a house Elizabeth would never see in person. The skin under her eyes was hollow. Her hair was pulled back. She looked into the camera as if she had only 10 minutes and intended to use 8 of them. "If you are watching this," she said in lightly accented English, "then I am already dead. Marcus and I are not in this house by accident. We are in it because a man in Washington has decided we are no longer useful. His name is Harrison Pierce. He has owned my husband for 20 years. Marcus tried to leave him this spring. Marcus signed papers with the FBI. Pierce will not allow that. Pierce will burn this house with us in it before he allows that. I have given a copy of these books to my friend Margaret Bennett, the only person in this country I trust outside of my own family. Margaret, my dearest, if one day your Lizzie watches this, tell her to stay far away from Pierce. Tell her..." The video cut off. Elizabeth pressed the space bar. Frozen mid-sentence, Sophia Sterling's eyes looked directly out of the screen at her son. Ethan stood up so fast the chair fell backward. His hands were trembling at his sides. His mouth opened, and what came out of it was not quite a word. "Pierce," he whispered. "Harrison Pierce. The man who held me at my mother's funeral. The man who paid for my law degree. The man who put me on the chair of Sterling Holdings." 3 days later, the Suburban slipped back into Manhattan through a service garage on West 59th and rose. On a private elevator the building did not list, to a penthouse that did not appear on any tax record bearing the Sterling name. 220 Central Park South was a property Ethan had bought through a Delaware shell company in 2019 and had never once spent a night in. Only 4 people on Earth knew the address. Connor was one of them. Eleanor was not. Elizabeth stood at the window the first morning and watched the southern edge of the park come awake under a thin glaze of new ice. Behind her, on a long ebony table, Ethan was working through the final pages of a forensic accounting brief that had been compiled in 72 hours by a 4-attorney team flown up from Boston. He looked up. "Tonight," he said, "we feed my uncle dinner." Victor Sterling arrived at 6:45 in a charcoal overcoat and a wide, easy smile, with a magnum of 1985 Brunello cradled in the crook of his elbow. He embraced Ethan in the foyer for a long moment, 3 solid claps to the back, and pressed both hands against Elizabeth's shoulders as if checking her for breakage. "My boy, my beautiful girl, you scared us half to death. Half to death. Whoever sent those men is not going to live to enjoy spring. I promise you that." Dinner was served by a private chef Ethan had vetted personally. Risotto Milanese, veal piccata, a small green salad with shaved fennel. Victor talked the entire meal about a senator who was running for re-election, about a horse that had thrown a shoe at Aqueduct, about a niece in Florence who was opening a restaurant. He was charming. He was, Elizabeth noted with a low, cold curiosity, very charming. Ethan listened. He laughed at the right beats. He raised his glass twice. "Uncle, I have not said this to you in a long time. You took me in when I was 26 years old and could not eat solid food because my jaw was wired shut. You sat by that bed for 7 weeks. I have not forgotten." Victor's eyes glistened on cue. "We are blood, Ethan. There is no other answer." When the dessert plates had been cleared, Ethan rose from the table, set his napkin beside his glass, and gestured toward the study at the end of the hall. "A cigar, Uncle. The boxes from Padron just came in." The study door closed behind them. Ethan did not offer a cigar. He lifted a thick manila folder from the side of the desk and set it square in the center of the leather blotter. He did not open it. He turned it 90 degrees so that the cover faced Victor, and he stepped back. "Open it." Victor's smile thinned. He opened the folder. The first page was a printout from the warehouse access log of Pier 12, dated 3 days before David Bennett's arrest. The second page was a still image of Victor Sterling himself, taken from the south-facing security camera at Warehouse 7 at 2:14 in the morning of that same day, walking through a side gate that had been keyed open with his biometric credentials. The third page was a wire authorization moving $12 million in unrecorded container value into a numbered account at a private bank in Liechtenstein. The signature at the bottom was Victor's. The fourth page was a forged customs seal, scanned at high resolution, with a name typed beneath it, David A. Bennett. Victor went the color of old paper. He laughed once. The laugh was not real. "Ethan, my boy, who do you think you are playing with? Why, Uncle? Why did you do this? $12 million is not worth a man's daughter writing a farewell letter on her kitchen table. You are not in debt. You are not in trouble. Who are you paying?" Victor said nothing. Ethan crossed the rug. "I'll answer it for you. Pierce." The blood left Victor's face in a single visible motion, from the brow down. "How much?" he whispered. "How much do you know?" "Enough to know you are not the head of this snake. You are the tail. He has owned you. For how long, Uncle? 25 years? 30? Victor sat down very slowly in the leather chair that had been placed for him. He aged 10 years between one breath and the next. "Pierce has a photograph," he said. His voice had become a thin, dry thing. "Of me. Of a girl. She was 17 years old in 1998. She did not survive the night. It was not my hand that did it. But the photograph does not care whose hand it was. Pierce has held it for 27 years. The day he tells me to do a thing, I do that thing. He told you to frame David Bennett. He told me to put David Bennett's name on something that would land him inside a Sterling warehouse, in a Sterling chair, in front of Sterling men. He wanted David Bennett to die at our hands. He wanted the blood on the Sterling crest, not on his. Why? Because 3 months ago, David Bennett walked into Pierce's district office on Lexington with a stack of photocopies. Photocopies of your mother's ledger, Ethan. He told Pierce he had received them from a friend of his late wife, and that he was prepared to walk them into the Southern District of New York if Pierce did not pull every existing claim against the Longshoremen's Pension Fund. Pierce sent him home with a handshake. The next morning, Pierce called me. Ethan stood at the desk. He did not move for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had gone flat. "You betrayed my father. You betrayed my mother. You betrayed me. And you betrayed the father of the woman I am married to. One life will not pay that ledger, Uncle Victor." He did not draw a weapon. He pressed the small button beneath the lip of the desk. The study door opened. Connor stepped inside. "Take him to the lower level," Ethan said quietly. "He stays alive. He is going to be a federal witness in 5 weeks. Do not let him die. Do not yet." The penthouse balcony at 220 Central Park South sat 112 feet above the southern edge of the park, and at 1 a.m, Manhattan unfurled beneath them like a circuit board lit from inside. Ethan was working on his third whiskey. He had not raised his voice once since Connor had walked Victor out of the study. He had not raised it during the 4-minute phone call to the team in Boston. He had not raised it as he untied his tie, dropped it across the back of a chair, and stepped out through the glass doors into the cold. He sat now on the low concrete bench at the balcony's edge with his elbows on his knees and the tumbler dangling between 2 fingers, and the silence he carried had a weight to it that Elizabeth could feel from across the terrace. She brought a blanket and sat beside him. 10 years, he said. The words landed in the cold like coins on a counter. Pierce sat next to me at my mother's funeral. He kept his hand on the back of my neck during the eulogy because I could not stop shaking. He paid for the law degree my father had been refusing to pay for. He stood up for me in front of the Casino Control Commission last March. He has called me son on 27 separate occasions that I have counted, in 27 separate rooms, and at 27 of those moments, I would have taken a bullet for him without raising my hand to ask why. She put her hand on the back of his. You had no way of knowing, Ethan. Pierce is not a man. He is a long-form plan. He did not answer. He set the whiskey on the concrete. He reached into his inner pocket and drew out the secure phone. He thumbed the video file open, the one from June 12, 2014, the one in Sophia's kitchen for what Elizabeth understood. With a low, painful clarity, must be the 5th or 6th time tonight. He let it run. This time he stopped it earlier than before. Sophia Sterling's face froze inside a sentence Elizabeth had not registered on the first viewing. Marcus had arranged for Ethan to study in Florence. He wanted him out of this country. He wanted him out of this life. But Pierce blocked it. Pierce wanted Ethan to stay. Pierce wanted Ethan raised inside the business. Pierce has plans for our son. Marcus is only now beginning to understand what those plans are. Ethan stood up so suddenly that the whiskey tumbler tipped and rolled across the concrete. Pierce wanted my father dead, he said. Pierce wanted my mother dead. Pierce did not want me dead. Pierce wanted me alive. Pierce wanted me alive so that he could inherit Sterling Holdings through a son he could keep on a leash. He turned to face her. The skin around his eyes had gone tight. I am not Pierce's son. I am Pierce's piece. I am a chess piece he placed on the board the day he killed my father and kept on the board because he had not finished using me. He walked to the railing. His arm drew back. The tumbler shattered against the inner concrete wall of the terrace in a fine, bright rain of crystal. 25 years, he said. The words came out of him as if each one had been held under water and was now surfacing for air. 25 years I thought I was building Sterling. Every contract I signed, Pierce profited. Every rival I removed, Pierce profited. The decision to legitimize Sterling Holdings into real estate and casinos and logistics, that was my decision. Liz and Pierce profited from it most of all, because what Pierce needs from me in 2026 is not a criminal network. What Pierce needs from me is a laundry, a clean pipeline, enough white money to fund a presidential primary campaign that begins next April. He pressed both hands flat against the railing. I have been a 36-year-old doll on a senator's mantle. Elizabeth crossed the terrace. She did not say anything at first. She put her arms around him from behind and laid her cheek against the wool of his sweater. He did not turn. He did not lean back. He simply stood at the railing with the night air on his face. And for the first time since she had known him, she felt the full weight of a man who had just learned that the architecture of his entire adult life had been someone else's blueprint. She let it pass through him. Then she spoke. You are not a piece on his board, Ethan. You chose to release my father. You chose to look for me for 10 years when no one asked you to. You chose not to kill me in your office the night I walked in. Pierce may have designed your life. He did not design your hands. He turned then, slowly, inside the circle of her arms. His eyes were wet for the first time in any room she had shared with him. Do you know the worst part, he said. I have been in love with you since I was 26 years old. A child whose face I could not remember. 10 years. And Pierce laughed when I called him to say I was getting married. He laughed, Liz, because he thought it was the casino PR play I had been pitching him for the better part of a year. He congratulated me. He sent a $100,000 wedding gift to a charity in your name. He does not know who you are. He does not know what you are to me. She lifted her face to his. Then he has already lost you, Ethan. For the first time in your life, you have a reason to act that is not him. He looked at her for a long moment, and behind his eyes, for what Elizabeth understood was the first time in 25 years something that had been a mechanism began to look like a man. I will not shoot him, he whispered. I will dismantle him with the same system he built to protect himself. For 3 days, the penthouse at 220 Central Park South stopped being a residence and became a war room. Ethan moved the long ebony dining table into the center of the living room and covered it in legal pads, encrypted laptops, 3-burner phones, and a corkboard that grew, hour by hour, into a constellation of photographs connected by red string. Pierce in the middle, Victor in the lower left, Marcus Doyle, the man who had pressed champagne on Elizabeth at the Met, in the lower right, Sophia and Marcus Sterling along the upper edge in old wedding day portraits. Margaret Bennett beside Sophia, David Bennett beside Margaret. Elizabeth stood in front of the board for a long time on the first morning. She had not expected to see her own mother's face on a wall like this. She did not say so. The 4 attorneys from Boston arrived at 6 a.m. on the second day, with 1 wheeled suitcase and 1 rolling laptop case each. None of them had ever worked for Sterling Holdings. None of them had ever worked with Pierce, Whitmore, and Sterling LLP, the firm whose letterhead had carried the contract Elizabeth had signed 6 weeks ago. The lead counsel, a woman named Iris Bow, drank 3 espressos before the sun came up and asked Ethan a single question. Mr. Sterling, are you willing to plead guilty to federal racketeering in exchange for the destruction of a sitting United States senator? Yes. Then we have a case. By the morning of the 3rd day, the plan had 3 prongs. The first was federal. Agent Sandra Lopez of the FBI New York field office had been on Ethan's quiet list for 2 years. A former Army criminal investigator with a clean jacket, 2 declined promotions, and a brother who had been killed by a contractor Pierce's office, had once recommended for a Defense Department subcontract. Iris Bow met her in a coffee shop on Lafayette Street, with a clean phone and a clean conversation. By noon, Lopez had been briefed. By 2, she had a copy of Sophia's USB, a notarized affidavit from Victor Sterling describing 27 years of coercion, and an audio file of Marcus Doyle, naming Pierce as the man who had paid him to approach Elizabeth at the Met. Doyle had been picked up by Connor on the second night at a bar in Astoria. He had asked for protective custody before Connor had finished asking him a question. The second prong was the press. Rachel Green of the New York Times had been chasing Pierce's casino licensing record for 14 months, without quite being able to land the story. Iris Bow met Green in a private dining room at the Algonquin, and gave her, in a sealed envelope, photocopies of the Sterling parallel ledger for the years 2000 to 2005, 5 years out of the 20 Sophia had documented. The deal was simple. Green would not run the story until Saturday at 10 o'clock in the evening. In exchange, she would receive the remaining 15 years on Sunday at dawn, ahead of every other outlet in the country. The third prong was social. Ethan dictated the invitation himself. The Sterling family requests the pleasure of Senator Harrison Pierce's company on Saturday evening at the Sterling Tower in celebration of preliminary approval of the Atlantic Crown Resort gaming license. Black tie. 8 in the evening. Press will be present. Pierce would come. He would come because the photograph he would be in Senator and family friend congratulate New York entrepreneur on Landmark Resort was a photograph he had been waiting 18 months to be inside. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Elizabeth sat down across from Ethan at the dining table and pushed a 4th folder toward him. There is one more prong, she said. My father. He looked up. Our mothers were friends, Ethan. My mother kept that ledger in a Chase Bank vault for 6 years before she died. There are things she may have told my father that she never put into writing. If my father can take the stand about Pierce, about Victor, about the night he was approached 3 months ago, that is testimony from a man who is not a Sterling. It is testimony from a witness Pierce cannot dismiss as an accomplice. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. He nodded once. They flew to Naples that night on a chartered Gulfstream. The plane landed at 11:30. A second car carried David Bennett from the secured residence on Marco Island to a private villa in Port Royal Ridge, and the reunion in the marble foyer lasted 17 minutes before either of them was able to speak in full sentences. David held his daughter the way a man holds a thing he had not been certain he was permitted to keep. When the crying stopped, he told them what he had never told her. Your mother knew Sophia from the Immigrants' Aid office in Sunset Park. They were both still learning English. They met over a Polish-Italian dictionary your mother carried in her purse for 2 years. They were friends, Lizzie. Real friends. When Sophia gave your mother that ledger in 2013, she made your mother promise that if anything happened to her, the books would go somewhere safe. When your mother got sick in 2012, she gave me a key. She made me promise that if you ever started remembering about the fire, I was to put the key inside the rosewood box. I did it on the night she died. He looked at Ethan. 3 months ago, I found a discrepancy at the pier. $12 million in container value, signed off by a sterling stamp that should not have existed anymore. I went to the only man I could think of who had the standing to investigate it. I went to Pierce. Ethan closed his eyes. He lowered himself onto one knee on the marble floor of the foyer. Mr. Bennett, I am asking your forgiveness for the warehouse, for the chair, for the photograph. I had no other way to keep you alive that week. And I am asking, sir, for your permission to marry your daughter. Not the contract, the marriage. David Bennett laughed, hoarsely, and rested both hands on Ethan's shoulders. You are asking the wrong Bennett, young man. Ask her. On the Gulf Stream back to Teterboro, somewhere over the Carolinas, Ethan reached across the cabin and folded Elizabeth's hand inside his. After Saturday, he said, if we are still alive on Sunday, I am going to ask you again. From the beginning. The 50th floor of Sterling Tower had been transformed for the evening into the kind of room that magazines call radiant. White orchids in alabaster troughs. Strings of low Edison bulbs along the windows. A 4-piece string quartet from Juilliard tuning quietly beside the bar. 80 of New York's most photographable people moved across the marble in tuxedos and gowns that had been pressed into garment bags 4 hours earlier. Pierce arrived at 8:12, on time to the minute. His wife wore a Tiffany pearl rope that had been on the cover of Vogue the previous October. He shook hands with the chair of the Casino Control Commission. He embraced the lieutenant governor. He moved through the room, like a man being introduced to a room that already belonged to him. Elizabeth wore a column of plain black silk that ended at her ankles. No diamonds, no bracelet, only the small silver paper crane, pulled out from beneath the silk for the first time in public, resting visible in the hollow of her throat. Ethan brought Pierce to her with a hand at the senator's elbow. Uncle Harrison, I owe you an introduction I have not properly made. My wife, Elizabeth, Columbia, School of Architecture, Senior, maiden name Bennett. Her mother was Margaret Bennett. The temperature behind Pierce's smile dropped 2 degrees. The smile itself did not move. Bennett is a very common name, he said. Elizabeth lifted her chin a fraction. Her voice did not shake. My mother was a friend of Sophia Sterling, Ethan's mother. And when I was 12 years old, Senator, I ran into a burning house on Riverside Drive. I pulled a young man out of the driveway. He survived. I have spent 10 years not remembering. I remember now. Pierce became a statue. The smile froze on his face like a thin sheet of ice over a deep pond. Ethan's voice was very soft. Uncle Harrison, I think the 3 of us should step into my office for a moment. Just a moment. Before the photographs. The office was 4 doors down the corridor. Connor closed the door behind them. Pierce sat in the leather chair Ethan indicated. The veneer was still in place barely. The hands that adjusted his cufflinks had begun to tremble in a way the cuffs of a $5,000 tuxedo were not tailored to hide. Ethan, my boy, what game are you playing tonight? Ethan did not sit. He opened the laptop on the desk. He turned the screen toward Pierce. He played the kitchen video. Sophia Sterling's face, hollow under the eyes, naming Pierce in lightly accented English. Pierce watched it without moving. Ethan opened a second file, the ledger. 20 years of HP, DC repeating down a margin in his mother's small handwriting. He opened a third, the audio of Marcus Doyle, recorded in a holding room in Astoria, naming Pierce as the man who had paid him to approach a young woman beside a champagne fountain at the Met. He opened a fourth, Victor's sworn affidavit, witnessed and notarized 2 days ago, 27 pages long. Pierce had not spoken for 2 minutes. Ethan finally sat. He spoke quietly across the walnut desk. 25 years, Uncle. You ordered my parents killed so that I would become an asset on your balance sheet. You framed my wife's father 3 months ago so that I would owe you the favor of a clean murder inside my own organization. You have owned me since I was 26 years old, and tonight at 8:46 in the evening you stop owning me. Pierce's hand moved. It moved faster than a 62-year-old hand should have been capable of moving. From the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket, he drew a Beretta 9mm blued steel, no longer than the span of his palm. He had carried it through the metal detectors of the United States Senate building for 12 years on a security exception. He leveled it at Ethan's chest. You, ungrateful boy, he hissed. His voice had finally cracked through the politician's veneer, and what came out of the crack was the voice of an old man who had not been told no since 1998. Sterling Holdings is mine. You are mine. Close that laptop, or I will end this conversation the way I ended your father's. The office door opened. Agent Sandra Lopez entered with her service weapon drawn and held low against her thigh. 6 FBI agents fanned into the room behind her, vests visible, weapons in low ready position. Senator Pierce, drop the weapon. You are under arrest. Pierce's eyes flicked to the corners of the room. A small camera, embedded in the spine of a leather-bound copy of the New York Penal Code on the second shelf of Ethan's bookcase, blinked once with a red pinpoint. Pierce understood, in that instant, what every word of the last 6 minutes had just become. He raised the Beretta. He did not finish raising it. The sound from Connor's suppressed sig came from behind Elizabeth's right shoulder, and Pierce's right wrist snapped sideways with the impact of a 9mm round through the soft tissue just below the cuff. The Beretta dropped soundlessly onto the Persian rug between his shoes. Pierce did not scream. He sat down very slowly in the leather chair, looking at the hand that had been the most powerful instrument of his career for 30 years, and watched it become a hand that no longer belonged to him. The FBI took him. The corridor outside the office had filled. In the 11 minutes the door had been closed, with cameras that had not been there at 8:12. Rachel Green of the New York Times was at the front of the line. Her phone was already open to the homepage of the Times, where the headline of the first article had gone live 3 minutes earlier. Pierce Ledger. 2 decades of payments from Sterling Holdings to a sitting U.S. senator. Ethan walked out into the flashes. He did not speak. He crossed the marble to where Elizabeth was standing. He took her hand. And in front of every camera in the building, in front of every newsroom that would carry the photograph on its front page in the morning, he leaned down and pressed his mouth to her forehead. For the first time, in any room in their marriage, that kiss was real. 6 weeks moved across New York the way the snow had moved across the dunes, slowly at first, then all at once. The federal grand jury returned its indictment against Harrison Pierce on a Tuesday in late January. 47 counts. Money laundering across 2 decades. Federal bribery. Conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of Marcus and Sophia Sterling. Continuing criminal enterprise. The Senate had voted to expel him on the Friday before. The judge denied bail in 7 minutes. He was held in solitary confinement at the Metropolitan Correctional Center pending trial, in a wing reserved for inmates whose continued breathing was considered a national security question. In the 3rd month of his confinement, Harrison Pierce was found by a guard at 4 a.m, with a torn bedsheet around his neck. The medical examiner ruled the death a suicide. People in the rooms where these things were discussed used the word ruled with a small private weight and did not press the point. Victor Sterling never went to trial. He took the cooperation deal Iris Bowe had drafted for him on the 2nd day in the war room. He pled to 4 federal counts, accepted 15 years at a low-security facility in Otisville, and waived appeal. He would be 73 years old when he walked out. Ethan visited him once, in the 2nd week of March. He did not speak. He set a small bunch of white carnations, the only flower his father had ever bothered to keep on a desk, on the metal table between them, and he walked out before Victor could lift his head from his hands. Marcus Doyle drew 8 years for his accessory role. He was sent to Lewisburg. David Bennett was cleared of every charge against him by a public statement from the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York on a Thursday morning. Sterling Holdings issued a written apology and a settlement of an undisclosed sum that David accepted only on the condition that 1/3 of it be placed into the longshoremen's pension fund whose ledger had brought him into Pierce's office 3 months earlier. He declined to return to the Brooklyn waterfront. He moved permanently into the Naples villa, took up painting watercolors of the bay, and began calling his daughter every Sunday at 5. Sterling Holdings itself was split into 2 legal entities by federal consent order. The Legacy Company, with its older holdings and shadow ledgers, was placed under a court-appointed monitor and slowly wound down to liquidation. The clean side, the casino license, the legitimate hotels, the commercial real estate portfolio was reincorporated as Sterling Bennett Group, jointly owned and jointly named. Connor Reed was promoted to Director of Security for the new company. He used the first 6 months of his salary increase to buy his mother a single-story house with no stairs in Forest Hills. On a Tuesday morning in late March, Eleanor Whitlock knocked on the doorframe of the morning room at the Hamptons estate. Elizabeth was at the writing desk, working through structural drawings for a midterm review. The housekeeper stood with her hands folded against the front of her gray dress. Mrs. Sterling. It was the first time Eleanor had used the name. Elizabeth set down her pen. I owe you an apology, child. I have stood in the foyer of this house for 41 years and watched a great many women walk through these doors. Almost all of them came for the name, and almost all of them left when the name no longer paid them. I assumed you would be another. I treated you accordingly. I was wrong about you. I would like permission to be wrong out loud. Elizabeth crossed the room and took the older woman's hands. You were not protecting yourself, Eleanor. You were protecting him. I have known that since the first week. There is nothing for me to forgive. Eleanor's eyes shone for a moment, and then the discipline of 41 years closed over them like a shutter, and she nodded once, and she went to oversee the polishing of the silver. The newspapers had begun calling it the collapse of the century. Long-form magazines were already commissioning the books. Ethan Sterling had been turned, in 8 weeks of coverage, into a double symbol, the victim of a 25-year manipulation that had hollowed him out from the cradle, and the man who had finally, at 36, dismantled the architect of that manipulation with the architect's own tools. He gave one interview. He gave it to Rachel Green. He spoke for 40 minutes about his mother. He did not speak about himself. On a chilly afternoon in the first week of April, Ethan and Elizabeth drove north through the Bronx to Woodlawn Cemetery. The redbuds along the inner road were a week away from blooming. Sophia Sterling's headstone stood at the head of the family plot in a small grove of black cherry. Marcus Sterling's stone stood beside it, his name carved beneath a date and an empty grave. Elizabeth knelt on the cold spring grass. She unclasped the silver chain from her throat. She laid the small paper crane on the curve of Sophia's stone, in the slight hollow where the carved name ended. I kept my mother's promise to you, Mrs. Sterling, she said quietly. Thank you for trusting her. Ethan stood behind her. He did not interrupt. When she rose, he reached out and brushed a single strand of hair back from her cheek. My mother, he said, would have loved you, Liz. They walked back to the car through the long aisle of yew. Neither of them was performing anything for anyone. There were no cameras at Woodlawn, no press detail, no security required. Their fingers were laced together at the knuckles for the first time in their marriage with no one in the world watching. 2 springs later, New York forgot the weather forecast for a single evening and gave itself an unseasonably warm night in early May. Sterling Bennett Group had just opened the ribbon on its first ground-up tower at Hudson Yards, 60 floors of layered glass and white-gray steel that bent inward at the upper third like a hand cupped to catch the play from the ribbon. Light off the river. Every architecture journal in the country had run a cover on it that month. The lead architect of record was a 24-year-old Columbia graduate named Elizabeth Bennett Sterling, who had walked across the stage at her graduation ceremony the previous May, with a baby photograph of her mother tucked inside the cuff of her academic gown. The penthouse at the top of the building belonged to her and her husband. She had drawn it herself. The kitchen faced the river. The bedroom faced the dawn. The terrace ran along 3 sides of the upper floor and looked out across a city that had spent 2 years rewriting the headlines that had once defined them. Ethan walked out onto that terrace at 9:30 in the evening. He was wearing a plain white shirt, the cuffs rolled to the forearms. No jacket, no watch. The gold cufflinks he had worn for 15 years were sitting in a drawer somewhere inside the apartment he no longer remembered. His hair had begun to silver lightly at the temples. He was 38 now, but his eyes, in the soft amber of the terrace lamps, looked brighter than they had been on the night Elizabeth had first walked into a room with him. He stood beside her at the railing for a long moment without speaking. Today is exactly 2 years, he said finally, very quietly, since the night you signed. She smiled without turning. I know. 24 months. The contract expires at midnight. He drew a folded packet of papers from the back pocket of his trousers and offered it to her. I had Iris draft it for me last week. It is a clean dissolution. You have fulfilled every obligation in the original agreement and every obligation I have invented since. Your father is free. Sterling Bennett is yours by half. You have your degree, your firm, your name on a building. You owe me nothing, Liz. You have not owed me anything for a long time. You are free to walk out of this apartment tomorrow morning and live anywhere on earth you would like to. Paris, Tokyo, Rome. I will not stand in your way. She took the papers. Her hands did not shake the way they had shaken the night she had picked up his Mont Blanc on the 47th floor of Sterling Tower. She read through each page in the warm light. He had written it himself, in his clean architectural hand, and every clause had been drafted in her favor. She walked back into the living room. On the low table beside the sofa sat a small silver Zippo lighter, Marcus Sterling's old lighter, the one Ethan had carried as a boy, the one Elizabeth had kept on her writing desk for the past year as a quiet kindness to him. She flicked it open. She held the corner of the divorce papers to the flame. The fire caught the cardstock the way she had once caught his life, quickly, completely, without hesitation. She dropped the burning pages into the crystal ashtray on the table and watched her freedom turn to ash. Behind her, Ethan had stopped breathing. He crossed the room in 3 steps and wrapped his arms around her from behind. Are you sure? he whispered into her hair. She turned inside the circle of his arms and lifted both hands to the back of his neck. 10 years ago, I ran into a fire to save a stranger, and I did not know what I was doing. 2 years ago, I signed a contract to marry a man I thought I was trading my life for, and I did not know what I was signing. This time, she pressed her palm flat against the front of his shirt. Over his heart, I know exactly who I am choosing. You are stuck with me, Sterling. He laughed, quietly, in the soft, private way she had heard exactly 7 times in her life, for the rest of it. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small black ring box. This one was not velvet. It was plain leather, worn at the corners, the kind a man might carry in a pocket for some time before being brave enough to use it. He opened it. Inside, on a small cushion of dark linen, sat a plain gold band. No diamond, no stone, no statement. Etched into the inner curve of the metal, just where it would rest against her skin, were 2 small paper cranes facing one another. She did not say yes. She did not need to. She simply held out her hand. Outside the terrace, the lights of Manhattan moved like slow water across the glass of the building she had built across the 24-year-old who had once run into a fire for a stranger, and the 38-year-old who had spent half his life looking for the girl who came out of it. Dear friends, every great love story carries a quiet question hidden inside its drama. This one asks something simple. How much of who we love is chance? And how much of it is the kindness we once gave to a stranger and forgot we had given? Elizabeth chose to run into a burning driveway at the age of 12, without knowing the man she was saving would one day be the man who saved her father, her name, and her future. She did not save Ethan in order to be rewarded. She saved him because in that moment, a child heard a voice in a fire and decided that a stranger's life was worth her own. 10 years later, the world gave that kindness back to her in a shape she could not have imagined. There is a lesson in that for all of us. The good we do in the world rarely returns to us on the day we do it. It returns slowly, in shapes we do not recognize, sometimes in the hand of a stranger who has been carrying our small kindness in his pocket for 10 years without knowing our name. Be the person who runs toward the fire when no one is watching. The universe keeps a longer ledger than we do. If this story moved you tonight, if you saw something of your own life inside Elizabeth's courage, or Ethan's quiet 10-year search, or David Bennett's faith in his daughter, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your subscription helps us bring you more emotional stories like this one every single day. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and leave us a comment below. We would love to know which moment in this story stayed with you the longest, and what does it remind you of in your own life. We read every comment, and your words mean more to us than you know. To everyone watching, from our hearts to yours, we wish you good health, peaceful days, and the quiet kind of love that finds you when you least expect it. Thank you for spending this evening with us. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.